Looks like the sound is coming through. Wonderful. All right, well, we will go ahead and get started. We've got a pretty large group on today's call. We're very excited to have Autumn and Dominique here today sharing their experiences. Before we get rolling, I will just go through a couple of quick housekeeping pieces before we start. So today is our regular Lunch and Learn webinar, which happens the second Tuesday of each month. Today's webinar is 1 CE you can earn from being here today. We do have a couple of upcoming sessions. We have one actually this Thursday. It's not part of our traditional series, but folks can register for this if they'd like. It's Thursday from 3 to 4 on billing essentials with telehealth and assisting management in the time of COVID. So this kind of continues our resources around the coronavirus and assisting social workers across the state. For May and June, we do have our traditional Lunch and Learn topic set. On May, we'll be talking about understanding kinship care, and in June, we'll be talking about integrating the mind and body practices into social work. I did also want to just remind folks that we do have a regular Friday Zoom meeting from 10 to 11 a.m. So if you have any questions related to COVID-19 and how it's impacting social work, we do an hour, usually less than an hour call about all the things that we're hearing. If you have questions, please feel free to email those over to us or join that call and we will answer those then. You can find registration for that on our webpage as well. During today's webinar, if you do have questions, please feel free to type those into the chat box. We will have a few opportunities to get questions answered throughout the webinar today. And if there are specific questions to Dominique or Autumn, feel free to type those in there and I will make sure to relay them. The training this Thursday and May and June's webinars are all free, so please feel free to join those. We'd love to have big attendance on all of those events. And then lastly, if you would like CEs for today, you will get a post-test link emailed to you. That will come an hour after our webinar ends today, so at around 2 p.m. today. Check your inbox from GoToWebinar, and that will just have a 5-question post-test. Fill that out, and we will email out your CE certificate. Last month's certificate will be emailed out later this afternoon. And thank you all for joining us for your membership in NASW. If there are any folks on the line today that are not members, we would love to have you join. I know we have quite a bit of students on the line today. You can join at socialworkers.org before graduation, and it's the best time to do that. So as we get rolling into today's session, I do have a quick poll question to see who we have on the call today. I'm going to launch this, and if folks will choose their option. What kind of social worker are you? Are you a student, clinically licensed, limited licensed folks, a macro licensed, limited licensed folks, a dual licensed, fully licensed social worker, or not licensed? So we just kind of want to get a snapshot of who is on today's call. We'll give folks about 10 more seconds. Okay, great. So it looks like on our line today, we've got about 40% social work students. So many of you hopefully entering the field here very shortly. Might be a couple of weeks for some of you on here. 25% have a clinical license, whether that's limited or full. About 10% have a macro license. 25% have both clinical and macro, and 4% are not currently licensed. So a little mix of everybody. But the bulk are students on this call, which is not surprising. Our goal today is really to provide some additional resources and to tell some stories about how folks get into macro level jobs out of school. We know that I was a macro student, I'm a macro licensed social worker, that transition from student to professional, or even once you're in the field, how do you move throughout that trajectory in a career can be sometimes challenging and difficult to navigate. So we wanted to pull together a couple folks in the field, Dominique and Autumn here today, and they're going to tell you their stories here in a few minutes about how to do that and how they did that. And we want folks to be willing to share your experiences or resources. So again, please feel free to use the chat box or to email us anything after this. So getting into what is macro social work. you know, an introduction to macro social work practice guide, tells us that macro social work is professionally guided interventions designed to bring about change at organizational, community, or policy arenas. We know that macro is this kind of all-encompassing, big picture area of social work. We focus on interactions between systems, both small and large systems. And I think that one of the things that the coronavirus has shown us is really some of the importance of macro work, of policy work, of collaborative work, at building technology that's going to assist our clients and our infrastructure as a field. We know that macro social workers do anything from public policy to research to working in governmental agencies and running for office to doing community organizing and advocacy work. And in Michigan, we have some specific data about macro social workers and just social workers in general. So we know that there's about 29,000 licensed social workers in Michigan. So we are a very large state of social workers, and that's as of April 1st. About 6,000 of those are limited licensed social workers. So we have a lot of newer professionals in our field here in Michigan. And that's because we're the third largest state of social workers in terms of programs. We have 35 schools of social work and about 6,500 social work students currently in either a BSW or an MSW program. And we're the #1 state for BSW level students at about 4,000, and we have about 2,500 MSW level students. We also know that of our fully licensed social workers, the majority of those folks have both the clinical and the macro designation. And that is primarily because when Michigan got licensure passed in 2005, folks got grandparented in at both of the licensure levels. Now, since 2005, individuals do have to choose one, at least initially, to get. So in Michigan, we know that probably 90% of folks who get their limited license now go for the clinical designation initially. But that does not mean that folks don't end up also getting a macro license, or there isn't a pool of macro folks who go for that right out of school. Now, when we look specifically at schools of social work from CSWE, there's about 8 to 10% of MSW students that are in macro tracks across the country. So a pretty small number, and that reflects then what we see at the licensure level. And we have seen a few different efforts across the country to kind of boost that number, especially in the more recent years. There was a campaign called 20 by 20 through CSWE and a couple other social work organizations that aimed to get 20% of MSW students in macro tracks by 2020. Now, they did not succeed to get the number to 2020, but that number of macro students did increase slightly during that campaign cycle. And I think when you look at Michigan, our schools of social work are very, very diverse in terms of the sorts of macro tracks or programs that are offered. You have schools like the University of Michigan who have almost 40% of their students in a macro program. And then you have other programs that are just advanced generalists like Grand Valley, and then other schools who really don't have a very large focus on the macro side of the field at all. So when we talk to students about getting into macro careers, there's really a huge variation in terms of what people are graduating and how comfortable they're feeling about moving into kind of a macro career. And I know that Autumn and Dominique here in a second are going to talk about how they navigated that. In terms of testing, we had only 127 social workers took the advanced generalist exam from ASWB in 2019. Now, that is not very many social workers especially across the entire country, not just Michigan. So 127, but we know that Michigan is only one of a few states that offer a macro license in general. Almost all of the states in the U.S. have a clinical license. Some states just have a generalist social work license, and then very few of us have that specific macro designation. Now, in Michigan, some of the history is the macro designation was really pushed for and advocated for here in Michigan because because for many macro social workers, they're left out of the traditional social work conversation. They're not viewed, sometimes within our own field, as social workers. And so by having that designation, part of it was to give recognition that, yes, this is a critical aspect of our field. These individuals play a really important role in social work, and we want to make sure that they have the same standing as clinical folks. So that's just a couple of the what we know right now here in Michigan. Now, going forward, what we see is that social work is the fastest growing field in the United States right now. And maybe not surprisingly, we know that the population is aging, and we expect about a 16% growth in the field between 2016 and 2026. So that provides a lot of opportunities for us as a field, both on the clinical side and the macro side. And so this is really a kind of a critical time for us as a profession to be thinking about, what do we do from here? What are kind of the new avenues that are growing in our field? And how can we kind of be more and more creative as we determine where people are working in social work? So I've been at NASW for 7 years now, and I think I've always been a macro social worker. I went into social work really never having a huge interest in clinical work myself. I wanted to do lobbying, political advocacy, education, and I think NASW was a great fit for me personally. But since I've been here, there has been kind of a shift, at least I have felt, in the field, specifically here in Michigan, about people wanting to get into macro tracks. And there's been a couple of specific areas that I have seen that have created that demand. One of them was the 2016 election. And I think after that election, we saw a huge number of social workers wanting to get more and more political and understanding how they could use their voice to help marginalized communities, to have a bigger presence in their community, and to really just be more effective advocates all around. Because if you think ethically, you know, we are all mandated to be political as our field. The whole last section of our code of ethics is all about community engagement and political action. And so we have seen, you know, this influx of social workers who want to get involved in community organizing, advocacy, and political engagement. And so a couple of the social workers that I pictured here is Fatima Salman in Detroit. She helped organize the Detroit Airport Rally when the travel ban was implemented. We have Zoe Seinfeld up at the top right, who was a speaker at one of the women's marches a couple of years ago. And we've seen social workers really take an active role in running for office. At NASW-Michigan, we held our first ever candidate training in February before kind of everything got crazy here, and we had over 80 social workers join that who are interested in running for office. So we're super excited for that. Another area that we've seen an increase in demand is the aging out of the field. Social work is an older profession in general. We're somewhere between 45 and 50 is our average age of our professionals. And so what we know is that there's going to be this influx of management level positions in the field open up in the next 10 to 15 years. And so we want to make sure that social workers who are graduating now or who are in the field now are ready to take on those positions as they open up in the next few years. The aging population, we all know that that provides a unique opportunity for us as professionals to be needed. We've got more folks in need of all sorts of services, and they will continue to be. We know that gerontology is a hugely growing, and we need more social workers in the area of gerontology. And I know Autumn will talk a little bit about her kind of experience in that area of the field. But we also need macro social workers in areas like gerontology and folks who are doing management and data evaluation and organizing work. And then the last thing I just wanted to bring up as creating a demand, and this one's going to be a continued conversation, is the coronavirus. How is this providing an opportunity for us as a field to grow or change? I think that there are going to be a lot of conversations about social work practice in general and how life is going to be different post-coronavirus, and how our field is going to change, how our communities are going to change, how our communication is going to change. And I think there's going to be a real need for more macro level folks, especially in the policy arena, as it relates to some of this. So those were some of our our demands for macro people. Some of the common questions and challenges that I hear and that we hear at NASW for macro students and new professionals, and we find this in the literature as well around macro practice, is not very much early curriculum around macro topics. And I'm sure many of the students can find this. Many times your policy class is your last semester of your undergrad. Maybe limited or lack of field opportunities for macro students, especially if you have a a specific area of social work practice you want to go into. Lack of student organizations around macro topics. I know that I think in the state of Michigan, there might be 2 macro social work student organizations in the whole state of Michigan. And that's just where we are right now. Lack of resources or very few resources for the licensure exam. When I took my advanced generalist exam a few years ago, there was one study material. It was an app that had some advanced generalist questions, but other than that, there was literally no other specific tailored study materials for the advanced generalist students. Now we do have a couple of options, but it's still very limited in comparison to the clinical folks. We get lots of questions about support from organizations around licensure and professional development. So when you do get a job or hired somewhere after school, what support is your organization providing around your social work credentialing, your licensure process, your exam, continuing education, and then the last piece is finding a supervisor. So many times you might be the only social worker at your organization, especially if you're doing macro work. You might be the first social worker. And so finding supervision can be a real tricky piece for many folks in the field. And I just wanted to bring this quote in from one of the research articles that I found, because I think this highlights some of the challenges that macro students and new professionals face, is students who enter MSW programs with their sights on agency leadership or substantial policy influence may feel pressure to reconsider their choice, whether due to limited attention to macro practice in program materials, limited macro faculty, and limited generalist exposure to macro content, or negative comments from fellow students, faculty, or field instructors. These students may lack the necessary information to make educational career choices that match their professional goals. I can absolutely confirm that we still hear that all the time from students, is that they're hearing they shouldn't get a macro license. They should go clinical right out of school. There's no options for you if you go into a career. It's not true. There are plenty of options for macro careers for folks, and that's partially what we wanted to do with this call today. Now that it's challenging because it looks different from a clinical setting. And I think that's where as a field we have felt the most comfortable, especially over the last 20 to 30 years. So we need to think more creatively about how we're talking to folks about licensure, about how we're talking to folks about career searching, and help provide more and more support for folks around that. So as we meet our panelists here, I did want to just mention there are 5 handouts for folks, so please make sure to download those before today's session is over. The PowerPoint's included in that. We also have handouts including some research, some career resources, our professional development booklet, and some information about social entrepreneurship. Now, those are just a snapshot of some materials that folks have access to. There are tons of macro resources out there, and so we're going to talk about those today. But I want to now kind of get into our formal but informal discussion that we're going to have here with Dominique and Autumn. So I would like just for the two of you to talk about a little bit about your social work journey. What made you choose social work, and what got you into that first job out of school? So maybe we could start with Dominique.
Sorry, I was that person talking with the mute on there. So, yeah, I actually had an experience, a personal experience that really got me into social work. I had never had any intentions in going into the field. Just a few years ago, I went on a study abroad trip, and I got the opportunity to volunteer at a refugee camp. And I really had a better understanding of what the vulnerable population went through. And I really just felt like a personal charge to get connected and really learn how I could serve this community. And I reached out to my best friend. Actually, she was getting her social work degree at UConn at the time, and she recommended I look into a field and a program at Wayne State, actually. So I looked into the program, applied. Surprisingly, I got in. I just spoke about my experience. So I was really nervous at first, thinking I didn't have what I needed to go into macro social work. And I just decided to make a shift from traditional corporate work into becoming a macro social worker. So I chose to actually study community development to better understand the refugee population. And I ended up diving a bit deeper and learning into more of like the global perspective in those vulnerable communities. And through that program at Wayne State, I was able to work with the National Association of Social Work Management, and I'll dive a little bit deeper into some of this stuff later, but and getting that certificate to really help me develop my strategic leadership skill set. And I learned that I could actually use my business acumen from my corporate background and bridge that with social challenges to combat them. And that's what the social entrepreneurship really has done for me at Wayne State. So I really pursued that background, and I also resonate with your last slide about the field placements. It can be really tricky to find a field placement that aligns with where you're going to really sharpen those skills that you want to develop. And I was able to do that through working with a mentor to help me intern or have a field site, at the Build Institute, which is a service development organization for aspiring entrepreneurs in Detroit.
I'm curious, Dominique, you talk about social entrepreneurship, and I know I mentioned that a minute ago. From your experience with that, what is like a brief description of what social entrepreneurship even means? I know it's kind of an emerging area of social work, so for folks who may be hearing that for the first time.
Sure. So in short, it's literally using business acumen to combat social challenges like poverty, homelessness, food insecurity, or even hygiene accessibility. And a great example of that would be Tom Shoes. You see, for every one shoe you purchase, a shoe is given to a vulnerable population. Warby Parker is a company actually made my glasses. So they're really cool glasses that are inexpensive compared to your traditional $300–400 you would spend. And for every pair is purchased by a customer like myself, they give a pair to a child who is unable to purchase glasses for themselves in developing countries.
Okay, thank you for that.
Sure.
Now, Autumn, let's hear a little bit about your journey.
So I actually got my bachelor's in neuroscience from Central Michigan University. Minored in gerontology, leadership, and psychology, and I was going to go into the medical field. I had all these plans, and then I graduated and was like, nah, that's not for me. So I took some gap time, and I was actually managing a group home with some gentlemen who had developmental disabilities, and was trying to figure out, I knew I wanted to go back to school. I didn't know what for. I had a friend who was like, you should really look into social work. And I was like, but I don't have my bachelor's in social work. Like, I can't do that. And they were like, yeah, you can. So I was like, oh. So I chose University of Michigan because of their geriatric scholar program and their aging focused curriculum. Got accepted, moved across the state. But ended up focusing on management of the human services and aging and families and society. Was a geriatric scholar, got my specialist in aging certificate and my management of the human services certificate, and pretty well all the way through my macro program there. I mean, you get in class and they're like, what are you going to do with this? And I'm like, I don't know. I know I don't want to work clinically. I know I like healthcare. I know I love older adults and adults with disabilities, and I'll find a way to make that work. And so once I get towards the end and I'm applying all over the place, and I found a job posting that had long-term care in it at the state and put my application out there. And it was actually in long-term care finance. And I know very little about finance or accounting, but what I do know is long-term care. So I think that's why they hired me, because I kind of bring that aspect to it. But my internships were really incremental in me choosing where I wanted to go. And yeah, so I worked in like all sorts of different long-term care. So like through school, I was an AFC. I interned at a skilled nursing facility. I was working at an HFA facility through my master's degree. And the AAA-1B was also one of my internships. So it was a very roundabout way. And I really don't think I chose social work. I think it chose me.
I think many of us feel that same way. And I think you make a really good point, Autumn, and that your track was more clinically focused while you were in school. Your placements were more of a clinical aspect, but now you find yourself in this pretty high macro level position. And I think that's a good piece of advice for folks too, because in terms of where you go out of school, social work can really take you anywhere. And that's really the benefit, I think, of having a BSW or an MSW degree, is it allows you to work at any sort of capacity in any sort of setting. And then as it relates to licensure, your first license really is dictated based off of what job you get out of school, not the track or the program that you're in. You could go completely clinical throughout your whole MSW program and then find yourself in a macro job and be macro licensed right out of school, or vice versa. We probably hear that a little bit more regularly, is that there are macro folks or macro students who end up getting in a more clinical position right out of school and get their clinical license first. But it can go either way. And we'll talk about licensing here in a minute. But I'm curious for both of you, looking back at your time in your programs, are there things that you would have done differently knowing what you do now in the field, or there are experiences you wish you would have jumped on during your MSW program?
For me, I can say that I wish I would have known that there was like some jobs with the School of Social Work that were pretty flexible, and like working with the aging cohort. That's not something I knew of. I think it would have saved me some stress of trying to work and go to school and live a life, doing my internships and everything. So I wish that's something I would have known. I had a really hard time getting into the classes that I needed to get into. And so I guess that's something that was kind of a downfall with my program, having to kind of fight for my macro classes. But otherwise, I really enjoyed it. I loved school.
Same. And I totally agree with you, having to fight for macro classes and getting the classes that, like, you'll get a set schedule, especially within your first year. And yes, those are classes that you have to do, right? Your foundation year, I think it's called. But I remember just going to my advisor, like, and getting approval to get in certain classes in my winter semester, because I'm like, my brain is like not just on the narrow scope. As I went throughout my program, I really learned the importance of micro. So I just want to say that for me, in order to function as a macro social worker, it is really important for me to understand what from the micro lens and what that experience is, so I can better serve, the overall population. But I would definitely agree with that, with fighting for classes. And I think for me, I had a lot of trouble understanding what careers were for me, because when you go online and you're searching on LinkedIn or Indeed, like I was just putting in social worker and all clinical jobs came up. And Duane, I think you mentioned, I typed it down, less than 10% of macros, social workers, less than 10% of social workers are macro, I believe, as opposed to clinical. So for me, I didn't understand that until later. So I think I wish I would have maybe been more active as a student on webinars like this.
I think that's a really good transition to our next topic, is how do you find your job in social work? And so for the two of you, what was your job search like, and how did you even get into your current position?
I can start that. I spent a lot of time just scrolling on Indeed and just pulling up different websites to look at different organizations to see what they look like and what they did. Going through like hospital job postings just to see what was out there and maybe what I was interested in and what I felt like I could plug into, not necessarily looking for things that specifically said social work, but like the posting I saw at the state. I was looking through state postings and this one said long-term care. And I was like, well, I know about long-term care. I meet the qualifications and I applied and here I am. But for me, it was just really just scrolling through websites to see what words are out there, what jobs are out there. There's a lot that you can really kind of fit yourself into that you may not traditionally think to search.
Yeah, no, I agree. For me, I was really searching to find a person that I really admired their work ethic and what they did in the community. For me, I happened to find the community relations manager for Ford Motor Company, Ford Fund. And she really worked with Ford in their corporate citizenship department and allocating funds to minority communities like women of color who are in need of different business grants and things of that nature. So that was something I really wanted to look deeper into because I knew I would have the opportunity to invest in Detroit community where I'm from and where I grew up by investing in those entrepreneurs who had really innovative businesses like and bringing things like parks, within the Detroit community, so kids had somewhere safe, a safe space to play in. So it was things like that that I really thought was important. So I think when trying to identify your career, sometimes just doing a bit of research on the experts out there who have done it can help you kind of navigate that. And I'd also say my really strong mentorship I had was speaking to my mentor who transitioned from a professor to more advisor to friend and really helping me navigate the skill set she saw in me and placing them within a career. And from there, I just use those keywords I learned and search Indeed as well, and LinkedIn as well. I don't know if a lot of folks find their jobs on LinkedIn, but if you search LinkedIn jobs, they have also an app for that. Like you just set up alerts like you would Indeed, and they'll funnel to you and kind of cut that process.
And I would definitely agree with both of you. But Dominique, I think you said a couple things that resonated with me. It's kind of sometimes about who do you know? And I think as social workers, that's a huge piece of our field. Half of our title is social. And so we have to be connected to resources. And sometimes that's a mentor. It might be a fellow student right now for many of you, somebody at your field placement, maybe somebody in a past career. I know from my role at NASW, I did not hear about it through a traditional method. One of my fellow students said, Duane, this is your job. You need to apply for it. I hadn't seen the posting, and I was like, I thought I'd be out in DC doing lobbying work after graduation. I was like, no, it's Michigan now, right? But I looked at it, I was like, yeah, that is what I want to do. This is the right fit for me. And sometimes it takes those other people in your life to really guide you into those directions and maybe point you into avenues that you're not seeing now. And I think especially for macro positions, because you're not going to traditionally do an Indeed search around social work, like you said, or you're not going to go to Google and find that. And even sometimes on the NASW job postings, there are going to be more clinical jobs posted in general, right? So we have to get more creative when it comes to finding positions. And a lot of times, what is the network that you've started to build while you're a student a lot of times, and how big is that network, and how sometimes being upfront with saying, hey, I'm graduating in May. I am looking for this sort of job. Does anybody have an option? Does anybody know or have heard about things? Because we don't always know what the other networks are from our colleagues, right? And so I think that sometimes those questions that we just throw out to those people in our lives can be very helpful. For I think one of the other tricky parts for macro folks as they do enter the workforce is justifying how and why their MSW qualifies them for their job. Now, Autumn, I think about your role specifically, you know, it wasn't tailored for a social worker, right? And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you have brought in your social work experience either into the interview process or into your role now.
Sure. So specifically, I'm involved in a lot of work groups at my job with different maybe policies that they're trying to implement or specific Medicaid programs. So I feel like my clinical knowledge really comes in handy in this like macro level job, where I'm bringing in like my personal experience on the ground working in these programs to these work groups and reminding people that there's people that we're serving and maybe how the certain policy may play out in a way that they may not think of necessarily. Whereas if I were to see that policy come through clinically, I'd be like, whoa, hold on a minute. But also, like in the interview, I remember one of the questions was, what's something that you're most proud of? Something that you've done that you're most proud of. And I had actually printed out a copy of something that I had done at my internship with the AAA, where we did a research project. And I had brought it and I gave it to the 3 people who were there interviewing me and was like, this is something that I did in my internship and I'm very proud of it. My boss actually asked, my now boss, who was interviewing me, asked like, what were some of your recommendations after doing this research? And I was able to talk about a few of the things, like being more like flexible with work schedules for caregivers, as opposed to just like paying direct care workers more. Because he was like, oh, well, everyone wants more money, but they don't typically kind of think of those more social, I think, outcomes that we could also do. And I think that's something that really I think that kind of helps square getting my job away, because I had something I was able to hand them. This is something I've done. It has some different recommendations that you may not be used to hearing, but it's social work, it's research. It had recommendations, but it was something they were interested in hearing.
I think research, it's clinical and macro, right? It's like that, there's a lot of overlap in our field. And so really depending on the sort of job you're applying for, skills are transferable across areas of social work, about types of social work into different non-traditional avenues. And I think you did a really good job of really figuring out how to talk specifically about how this skill is going to be relevant to this job that I want right now.
Mm-hmm.
So there's been some questions that have come through so far about finding a macro social work job. And some of these you two have already mentioned about networking, about finding a mentor. What is your why? And I think I'll have you talk about that in a second here, Dominique. Creating a digital resume and being open to innovative and new opportunities. But what I can say about the remaining open to new and innovative opportunities, that I think is universal across social work. We do so many different things all the time, and we're usually connected to so many different organizations and groups that you're going to get asked to be a part of something, to join a board, to share your knowledge, to do something that's really outside of the box. And I think sometimes being open to just saying, yes, I'm willing to try that, even if I fail, I think can really strengthen your own professional self. It'll push your comfort zone, and it can provide those next opportunities that you don't even know are out there. You know, I can give a couple examples for myself. You know, from my role at NASW, I can say I have met people at conferences that only know me because I run the NASW-Michigan Twitter account, right? It's really weird when you go into a conference session that's about maybe social networking or communications or policy advocacy, and you sit next to somebody and you're like, oh, you run that other organization's Twitter account. Oh, you do that. We need to talk. I can put a face to the name, right? Or because of some writing that I did in the past. I got to be a part of a national podcast series for a year around social work, right? Things that I really would never have thought would have been an opportunity for me in the past. But I think as social workers, we get sometimes presented these very strange, sometimes feeling like strange opportunities that just say yes every once in a while if you have the capacity, because they're going to open up other doors that we don't even know, and it could lead into a career down the line. And I don't know if either of the two of you have kind of similar experiences that could share.
Yeah, I don't know. Oh, well, I'll go. Yeah, I agree with you 100%. It's like that Shonda Rhimes book, What Year of Yes, right? But I think the biggest thing I could say to empower social workers is to be their own advocate. Work on projects that you're saying yes to, where you can produce tangible results, and really leverage data and research to help build your story. So we're in a lot of these rooms now where when we do get the opportunity to sit at the table with the powers that be, right, which social workers should be at those tables in general, but when we're actually at those tables, sometimes we don't have the tools to prove our case, because we are scared of the research, or we are scared of using Excel. So I would really just push us to continue to learn those and say yes to those type of opportunities. And in particular, like Duane mentioned with NASW. So my mentor really brought NASW to my attention, and she spoke to me about running for the secretary position last year. Wow, it's like time is really flying. And I was just like, are you serious? Like, I had no intention of applying at all, but she really just helped me identify some skill sets that I could bring the value to the board, and also what the board could in return provide me with really sharpening my leadership skills, understanding how to delegate. And I'm the secretary, so I'm the annoying person too that's like, hey, hold on, we got to reel it back in. So it's really helping me just be organized and staying on top of things, and supporting the executive committee with ensuring the things that we need to get done are done. So we're pushing, NASW forward, and we're meeting the needs of our members, because that's what matters most. So I think that's really just a great example of me saying yes, having no clue, how to really run the position, but just kind of leaning in on when I'm asked, because someone else is seeing something in me. And I think we have to be receptive of that, of our mentors seeing that, and just being open, like, especially in school, it seems like we have a lot of students on the call. I would just say this is the time to just try everything. Like, just try it and see what happens, because it's not like you're in a full-time role where they're like, hey, you did something wrong and we're letting you go. No, you're in a practice, right, a field practice, where you can say, hey, this is something I worked on, and you're sharing something. It's not, you're just not being a talker, but you're sharing something you've worked on, and say, hey, this is this tangible product or project I've worked on. What are your thoughts on this? How can I make this better for the role that I want to be down the line? So.
Yeah, I could echo that and say that when I was in my second internship, and I was starting to look at jobs, I was looking at like quality assurance kind of things. I was like, I'm really interested in this, and being open with my internship supervisor at the time, he was able to get me plugged into the agency's quality assurance team to get some experience with that and auditing, and that has been really beneficial.
Awesome.
Great. And some of these other tips, we talked a little bit about social media, but the more comfortable we are with technology, I think the better prepared we're going to be for some roles that are out there. And I think you're seeing right now with the crisis that's happening, folks who have tech skills are in high demand in social work, right? As we transition people kind of immediately into telehealth, or we move practices completely online, the folks who have some of that innate skill, or that skill that they've worked on, are really in high demand right now. But you see kind of unique roles for social workers too, or potential roles for social workers as social media managers, as community organizers. In the policy world, there are folks that are running campaigns or doing the digital organizing for campaign work. And those are going to become, we want social workers in those roles, because I think we bring a very unique perspective into that piece. And I can absolutely echo what Dominique said, is, just try stuff right now. This is the time to do something that you find out you hate. And partially that's what field is for, right? You know by the end of your field placement whether you want to work in that sort of setting or not. Usually probably by the first month that you're there, you're like, nope, or yes, I love this sort of work, right? That's the benefit of our field opportunities here. I did want to mention a couple of specific job search sites. Now, I personally say word of mouth is going to be your best bet in social work in general. Yeah. Who you know is going to probably get you into the most ideal position. But that doesn't mean there are not actual job search engines like Indeed, LinkedIn, absolutely. NASW has postings, ACOSA has postings, some of the schools of social work have them, and there are lots of them specific depending on what sort of job you're interested in. And there's government sorts of job search, nonprofit job search, academic job searching, organizing job searching. So just like any clinical aspect, you kind of got to narrow down what your focus really wants to be out of school, and then you can find what's going to work best for you. On the NASW-Michigan website, we have a sub-tab in our Career Center specifically that has many of these job research search links here for it. But one of the handouts that I wanted to make sure folks were accessing was the professional development booklet that is in the drop-down. Now, in that, there is a couple of things that are going to be helpful, I think, for folks. One of them are going to be specific words that you can specifically look at that may be macro search items for a job. The other thing that's going to be helpful is potential job titles. Now, I hear this from students a lot. How do I know what sort of job title to look for? And this, my first advice is don't wait until the week before graduation to start thinking about this, right? You need sometimes months or years of planning to start thinking about what those titles look like. And NASW-Michigan, we had our macro summit was a year and a half ago now, where we had about 100 social workers who were in macro areas of social work come together in Novi. And one of the questions we asked folks are, what sort of job titles have you held throughout your career? And some of them I listed here, but social workers in macro are just as scattered all over the place as clinical folks in terms of our job titles. It can be anything from coordinators to directors, from consultants to analysts, to supervisors, to authors, to faculty. And so figuring out what do you want out of your career, that's going to help narrow it down, right? And so in that professional development booklet, there's, I think, almost a 2-page list of potential job titles, right? But we know that there are so many other out there. And even just the 3 people we have on this call, we have an analyst, a manager, and a director, right? And so those are some macro level titles, but clinical folks could also have all of those titles, right? And so I think that's where we don't always have to reinvent the wheel as macro people. Skill set may look a little bit different depending on the particular position we're applying for, but those titles may not actually look that different at the end. We did have somebody comment on something that I thought was really kind of right on too. Macro social work requires a variety, and this is from Angela, macro social work requires a variety of skills and knowledge and training that is not typically included in social work programs. It sometimes means social workers who may start or come from another field or profession are uniquely prepared for these roles. These individuals bring other skills to our field, like human resources, finance, science, that support macro social work and clinical social work in those roles. And I can absolutely agree with that. And I think that's one of the real highlights of social work is that we have a non-traditional base in our students. There's a lot of older students or folks who are coming in second, third, fourth career, and those skill sets really provide a unique insight. And I don't know if either of you have kind of any insight on that from your perspective when you were in school.
I'll go really quick. I'll keep it short. I know we're hitting like closing time. 100%. I came from a background in corporate where I first started off as a sales rep. So I was dealing with a lot of Excel, working with people, managing them, and then moving on to a sales analyst where I was then looking and seeing what the sales reps were doing in the store, and then how could I better support them by letting them know, hey, let's go in this direction or let's pivot. So coming into social work now, I'm like, wow, how are we monetizing our value, right? Why are social workers doing all the groundwork and we're not getting paid enough? And then the third thing I would see with like, how come we're not leveraging our data and research that we're using to really build our case? Because I found that when we do have those opportunities to really talk to the policymakers or managers at jobs, for example, we're not really able to share the research and data that supports why certain moves need to be made and why they should be person-centered as opposed to driving the dollar.
Mm-hmm.
Really important.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I did just want to, we'll breeze through a couple of slides really quick because I want to give Dominique and Autumn a couple more chances to talk before we're out of time. That's the tough part about these hour calls, they go so quickly. But a couple of macro social work organizations that I just want folks to know exist. So we've got, NASW, obviously. We have a lot of specific macro groups that people can get involved with at the state level if folks are interested, including political action committees and legislative and social policy committees. There's the Network for Social Work Management, the Association of Community Organizers, the Society of Social Work and Research, the Congressional Research Institute for Social Work and Policy, and there's more that are out there. But these are good things to start getting connected with, even if it's just through social media in free ways. Most of these organizations do have a membership fee, but the more information and networking you can start now, the better that's going to set you up. And many of these particular organizations also do have job postings. And then as we talked about social media, almost all of these organizations have social media, whether it's Facebook or Twitter or LinkedIn accounts, including the schools of social work. There is a macro social work Twitter chat that happens almost every Thursday, and that's if you use the hashtag macro social work, macro SW. It's at 9 p.m. our time, and if you go to the macro social work website, you can find all of those different topics about what they're talking about each conversation. So just another couple of resources for folks. But I wanted to talk to you about some of the logistics of where you're currently working now, and how have you had to advocate for yourself as a social worker in your roles, if you have had to?
So I have had to advocate for myself extremely in my role, and it started with getting paid for my master's degree. I'm in a bachelor's level position, and when I was getting hired, I was like, so I have a master's degree, do I get paid more? And they said yes, but they wanted proof that like I had already graduated, but I was starting the Monday after graduation was on a Saturday. And I ended up getting to the point where I literally sent them pictures of me walking across the stage right after graduation and a picture of my name in the bulletin, and was like, this is all I got right now, guys. Like, I don't have my diploma, my GPA or my transcripts aren't going to be finalized until January. I don't know what else to tell you. And they ended up granting me an extension. And I did end up getting paid extra for my master's degree. And so that's one form of advocacy for myself. Second was asking about supervision and licensure. And I was ultimately told that since my job position doesn't require a social work license, that there was nothing that they could do policy-wise. So I had to take that upon myself and figure out what macro licensure looks like from a position that it's not supported for. So talking to a past professor, and she sent me some supervisor links, and a couple of them didn't work out, and I ended up finding Duane, and he's been doing my supervision. So I've really had to, I feel like, fight for everything that I've needed to get as a macro social worker.
Yeah, and that's not uncommon for especially macro folks in non-traditional roles, especially if there's no other licensed professional on staff, as you may have to provide contract out supervision. But I think using that as a talking point for your organization about, by having me as a licensed person here in the future, I'm going to be able to offer that supervision for somebody. So they're not going to have to pay out of pocket, or you're not going to have to pay as an organization, right? We can then take interns potentially by having somebody else who's a social worker on site. So there's going to be some financial benefit to the organization long term too by having you there. And I think sometimes we forget to talk about those when we're negotiating this. Like, yes, you're putting an investment in me right now by if you can reimburse the licensure process, or if you can reimburse me getting supervision. But like Autumn, there are going to be organizations that say, no, you don't have to have this for this particular position. And one of the questions that came through was, is licensing really needed for macro social work? And so my opinion on that, if you are a social worker, yes, you have to have a license. That is the legal requirement in the state of Michigan. If you want to call yourself a social worker and work as a social worker, you have to have a license, whether that's clinical or macro. Now, for many macro people, our jobs are not going to require that we have a license. That does not mean that we shouldn't have a license at the end of the day. And I know there's lots of mixed feelings about it at this point, but legally wise, the more macro people we have out there, the more it's going to be easy for us to advocate for macro people, the more we can use that as leverage for exam help, for supervision help. And really the whole point of having a macro license is to boost that credibility of that side of the field, because by not having those folks as licensed, what we find for macro people is they almost always immediately leave formalized social work because they can't call themselves or work as a social worker, so why? They don't need continuing education, they may not be connected to the same networks anymore. And so as organizations, we're trying to provide more avenues for folks to stay part of the field, because macro people are an integral and historically important part of our profession. So the licensure piece, it gets tricky for folks. I know we only have a few minutes left here, and I think we'll stay over for the questions that have come through, but I want to make sure that we get through we just have this last slide. But how are the two of you still connected to social work in your role in a non-traditional job?
So for me, it looks like licensure. That's a huge way that I stay connected. But also, being connected through work and the committees I'm on and the work groups. And locally, I got asked to be on an advisory council as being like the social work kind of representative for it. And I was like, heck yeah, let's do that. Tuning into these NASW webinars are really helpful to stay connected to the community. And even just messaging the people that I went to school with and being like, what are you up to these days? What does your job look like? What are you doing? That's awesome. So that's how I stay connected.
Yeah. Now, Autumn, I know when you talk about some of your committees, I know you. I know that those were not opportunities that necessarily were just like thrown at you generally. You've had to do your own advocacy to say, hey, I think I really would like to be a part of this, or we have the extra, I have the extra time in my schedule. Are there opportunities that I can get involved with, or I found this opportunity? I mean, can you confirm how you have had to self-advocate to be a part of some of those organizations in your role?
Oh yeah, so some of them are just, they'll be like, hey, we need somebody in this work group, and I'm like, heck yeah, sounds good. But some of them, I go to my supervisor and I'm like, I'm really interested in this. I know that they have this meeting. Can I come? Can I come with you? Because I know you go. Can I go with someone else in my section? Because I know that they go. And usually I haven't been turned down yet. So they're pretty open to letting you get your hands into the different opportunities around, because there's a lot that my division touches on, because we technically work with all of Medicaid. So even though I typically work with long-term care data, sometimes I'm working with child-related data, and sometimes I'm working with durable medical equipment, and just really being open to being like, yeah, I really need to learn more about this. So for me, like working with data especially, I don't know a lot about SQL. And so I asked if I could go to this meeting on learning more about SQL, because I was like, I think it'd be helpful to be able to pull my data a little easier. And they're like, sure.
Yeah.
So.
That's awesome.
Dominique, how are you connected still?
I'd say with, NASW and being on the board, I really try to use my voice to be, to use my position to be a voice for social workers. I try my best also to advocate for us. And that's really just by supporting NASW and our initiatives as best as I can and sharing that within my network. And I think from the social entrepreneurship lens, I really just charge myself with being a catalyst in this field and letting people know, like a lot of folks when they first talk to me don't know I'm in MSW. So I want to make sure that I'm doing everything that I can to provide MSWs with the skill set they need to get their practices off the ground, or programs that they're interested in doing. And doing that through my own social enterprise that I started by using my network, to provide hygiene boxes to resettle refugees in Detroit. So yeah, I think that's really how I'm really just trying my best to use my voice.
We didn't get to your side enterprise really today, Dominique. And I think, as social workers, part of our strength is our stories. The more people that you talk to and get connected with, the more of these unique, really fascinating opportunities you're gonna hear about. But I know we're pretty much out of time today, so I'm gonna skip a little bit over the COVID stuff because I think it's not as relevant to some of the questions that have come through. But I did want to make sure that folks saw that there are some other resources available in the PowerPoint, as well as some data that can be found around these topics. But I wanted to go through some of the questions that have come through, and so folks need to leave. Please feel free to fill out that post test once you get that email to you. But I want to go through a couple of these questions that have come through for folks, and maybe the last 5 minutes of going over. So some of them are more specific around money. So a couple of folks asked, for new social work grads or for macro folks, is there a difference in salary between clinical and macro practice? And the answer to that, at least from my data research and what I know in the field, is yes, there is differences between macro and clinical folks. There's usually about a $5,000 difference starting out from a new social worker. Macro is a higher paid field. But if you think about those roles, they're usually more management level positions in many of the organizations. So many times those are going to be the higher paying positions, even if they're in a more traditionally clinical setting. Now, with that, I will say that there's a huge range in salary in social work in general, right? It really depends on the sorts of organizations you're applying to work for, the part of the state that you're living in, your skill set and what you bring to the table. Because like what Autumn said is she had to negotiate a higher rate because she was an MSW in a DSW level or a bachelor's level position. And so we may have to do that. And don't be afraid to negotiate. Actually, everybody on this call should negotiate their salaries, because we know that women are much less likely to negotiate their salaries right off the bat, and our field is 85% women. And we're also a lower paid profession in general. So taking that opportunity to make sure that you're advocating for yourself, especially if you're in a non-traditional setting. So there are some other conversations around negotiation and salary negotiation specifically. Do you pay licensure reimbursement? Do you have supervision on site? What are the fringe benefits? Because that whole package is going to really be critical. And once you get your full license, you're going to need continuing education. So is there professional development funds available at our organization? I know at the state there's lots of educational opportunities, but are they social work educational opportunities? And so sometimes organizations will pay for their membership fees and things like NASW. Lots of questions that you want to start thinking about, especially as you're going into a non-traditional role. And I don't know, do either of you have other comments kind of on the financial side?
I agree.
Not really. Yeah.
So one of the other things that ties into that is there was just a comment from Maria. There is very limited professional development for people working in macro fields. Yes. Yes and no. So there are very limited social work professional development for people working in macro. There are lots of trainings and conferences around macro topics, but they're very rarely run by social work organizations. And so again, we sometimes have to get a little bit more creative when we're trying to find education around our skill set. And what I would recommend for folks if you find a really good training, or you're a part of an organization that does really good training around macro topics that doesn't offer social work CEs, there are ways to get that stuff approved and then open it up to a larger scale. And I think there are social workers out there that would love to see more macro content. And it's, sometimes we just have to do, again, that advocacy to our organizations, because they don't even know they could potentially open it up to a social work audience, and that social workers would be interested in learning about grant writing or budgeting, staff management, you know, all those things that we do want.
Yeah. And real quick, Duane, just to Autumn's point, she mentioned that there were a few things that she wanted to do, and she ended up bringing it to her managers, I think, Autumn, you were saying, and telling them why she needed it. And I think by saying, maybe tying some data, like, for example, it could be like, hey, I work with this vulnerable population, and X amount of data shows that we need this. This conference will help support that. I need support with getting to this conference, you know, something like that.
Yeah.
Okay, if you are macro licensed, can you ever do clinical and or bill for services? This has been a pause for me. Lack of supervision and applicability as a macro license as a requirement. So macro people cannot bill for clinical services. That's kind of like the black and white line for there. Macro people can bill for some things. There are macro folks who have consultation businesses that do lots of social entrepreneurship, but in traditional like healthcare billing, usually macro people cannot bill for that. However, once somebody gets a macro license, they can add the clinical designation if they would like. It's one more year of work under supervision, and they have to pass the clinical exam. But we recommend for folks who are working kind of in a hybrid setting or want to do both of those kind of fields that they look into that option as best as possible. Yeah, it's tricky. And then we have a couple questions that I don't think we know the answer to yet. I graduate in a couple of weeks. I've been job searching. Things look promising, but everything seems stalled now due to COVID-19. Any advice on the job search timeframe for those of us graduating now? All right, I'll leave that first open to you, and then either of you have thoughts on that?
I know that most organizations are frozen on their hiring right now, so unfortunately it's just a really bad timing. I would also encourage you to be patient though, because once we get back up and running, they'll be hiring again. But I know at the state, our departments aren't hiring.
Yeah.
So it's really frustrating, and I empathize for you, man.
Yeah, 100%. I definitely empathize with you guys as well. I would definitely say, but do what you can. I would reach out to folks over LinkedIn and ask for like a virtual coffee. And I mean, you know, and just try and make it creative and say, hey, I'm a student graduating in a few weeks, and making about a learning experience as opposed to, hey, I need to get hired right now, because you can build your network right now, build mentorship. So when this is over, hey, all you have to do is reach out and say, hey, I need some help. You know, I'm looking for a job, and those people can really help navigate things for you. There are a lot of virtual conferences happening right now as well. So going back to finding those folks who are doing what you want to do, they can help you identify exactly what that job title is, and you can take advantage of cheaper rates at this time that they're charging for conferences, and learn and grow and get better and better. So when it's time to go, you're ready.
And if you don't mind healthcare, there's a lot of places that are hiring like temp social workers just for all this coronavirus stuff. So, I mean, it's a way to get some social work experience. Not quite macro, but it's social work experience. It's a job.
Yep.
And what I'm seeing through NASW is there's still lots of organizations still submitting job postings right now.
Oh yeah.
The times that they're hiring may fluctuate a little bit in terms of how they're doing interviewing and their capacity to actually bring somebody on right now. But there are organizations still hiring. And the other area that I would really recommend for folks, especially for the macro people on this call, is it's an election year. There are lots of political candidates that are hiring folks right now to do organizing work and political campaign work. So if that is all an interest to you, those jobs are like aplenty right now. So find a candidate that like you love And especially if it's like a federal level candidate that probably has some resources right now, they're going to be looking for campaign staff right now. And especially if you have some tech ability, if you know social media, if you know community organizing work, Michigan is going to be another battleground state. So they want folks who are in that. And if political work especially is something that you're interested in, that's a really good way to get into those sort of jobs long term. So those are just a couple of suggestions there. What kind of opportunities for macro practice are available in northern Michigan? So I'd say they're different but the same. Most of your organizations have macro level positions. They're executive directors, they're policy analysts, they're supervisors. Those are all macro level jobs that we don't often associate with macro social work, but those positions exist in clinical settings. So pretty much every clinical organization that exists in your community, there's a macro level job, at least one, if not multiple jobs there. So sometimes we just have to kind of switch our framework in terms of what we're thinking about. And they may, again, not require a license to practice there, but they are still, your skill set is going to be relevant to those jobs. Okay, so this might go to either of you. How have your certificates been impactful for your jobs now?
I don't feel like I had to do too much extra to obtain my certificates, but I feel like they work well as like resume builders and like bargaining tools. I have mine like displayed in my cube at work, and they're good talking points. They'll be like, oh, you're a specialist in aging. What does that mean? And I can be like, well, this is what that means for me.
Yeah.
I do it. Like, I didn't have to, but I would recommend it if it's an option for you to get your certificates. Like, yeah. I didn't, being a geriatric scholar, I already had to do the extra things to do that. So it wasn't really anything too extra for me. But even if it is, those extra experiences, it's going to help build your rapport of skills.
Yeah. No, I agree. The Human Service Management Certificate, I think, has been helpful. It's also a really great topic, like in interviews and things like that. It helps you kind of maintain that network of social work management. So I think that was really beneficial. And guys, it's like $50. Well, speak with your advisor about it and make sure your class is aligned. But it was literally like $50, and I just made sure my track incorporated those classes. And essentially, right now, I'm a project manager. Like with everything going on, how my role had to shift. So I would say that helps. But for the most part, I really am passionate about social entrepreneurship. And I know that me just managing a team will help me down the line, just not in this role right now.
I really appreciate everybody staying on the line a little extra to get some of these questions answered. And I thank Dominique and Autumn for sharing your experiences with us. I'm wondering, as we end today, if there's any last tip or piece of advice you'd want people to leave with.
I can start. So something that I was going to say that I haven't had a chance to say yet was just now that I'm in my job, one of the things that I've done is really look at my org chart to figure out what are my options for moving up. So I knew when I got into the state, the goal is to eventually work up into a management level position. So what does that look like in my track and how can I get there? But the other thing is like MDHHS is huge, guys, it's huge. So what kind of departments would I potentially see myself plugging into? And just seeing like what's out there and how things are connected and the people that I might need to network with. That has been really valuable. And then when I'm in work group meetings or whatever, I'm like, ooh, that's somebody that's over in this department, that's one of the places I could see myself fitting into someday. I need to talk to them. And maybe I need to figure out maybe what they do. So I would very much recommend looking at your org chart. I love org charts because I like to see how things fit together, but just seeing where you want to go in the future. And it's a good tool to see how things are connected and give you some options for the future.
That was great. I agree with that, just being very strategic and intentional about how you go about those type of things and looking and seeing what relationships will work best for you. For me, it would be to really know your why. You're not going to be happy if you go after the sexy job title if that's not where you're supposed to be at. So I think it's really important to know who you are. I know that I'm a connector. I know that my purpose is to bridge the gap between people and resources that they need, period. So whatever role I have, in order for me to truly be efficient in that role and do a good job, it has to be a part of that some way or somehow. So knowing what that looks like for you, what's your why, and directly aligning that with the jobs you're applying for. And if that doesn't work, you shouldn't apply. And I'm just saying that because you'll be better in the long run because it's something that you're passionate about and you will do a good job at.
Fantastic. That was really great advice from both of you. And I thank you for your leadership right now. And I know it's a strange time to be away from work to have a conversation like this, but I think I know I appreciate it. And if folks have questions after today, please feel free to email me and I can share that with Dominique and Autumn. And then make sure to download the handouts. Again, if folks need anything else after today, please feel free to reach out. And we hope to see you on this Thursday's call. If not, we'll hopefully see you next month. So we'll go ahead and end for today. Hope everyone has a good rest of your week.
Thanks.
Bye.
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 Great meeting.